Association of American Medical Colleges is pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Promising Practices for Evaluation and Assessment of Pathway Programs. My name is Darian, and it's my pleasure to facilitate. We are recording, and we will email you when it's ready. We muted all participant audio. If you need help, please send us a message. This presentation includes time for Q&A. You may submit a question at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. There are handouts available that complement the session. To access them, please look in the Resources tab of the virtual community over the next week for updates as they are added. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Travis, Associate Vice President, Faculty, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for UT MD Anderson Cancer Center. Dr. Travis?
Thank you very much, Darian. Good afternoon and good morning for some of you who may not be on the East Coast or in the central area. Welcome to all of you. It's so exciting to have all of you here today. I'm Elizabeth Travis, and it's my pleasure and honor to serve as the moderator of today's webinar. The topic, Promising Practices for Evaluation Assessments of Pathway Programs. This is a topic of great interest to all of us, and necessity if we are to broaden and attract the future workforce in science and medicine. I am a former member of the board of directors of the AAMC, and actually was there at the time when we were talking about the new strategies that the organization was to embark on. And this is one of the outcomes of those strategies, of those new strategic plans. So I also am a scientist, and I have a definite interest in this as well because I direct a large pathway program, which we just wrapped up our summer program this last week. And like all of you, I really do need to learn more about, how to assess, not only the evaluation of the program, but what impact is the program having? Are we indeed meeting our goals with the programs that we are doing? So our three speakers today are leaders and have a wealth of knowledge in the area of assessing and evaluating medical, science, and health educator programs. I'm going to start by thanking them for contributing their time and their efforts to this webinar today, and taking time to share their knowledge with you. I know that all of us are going to walk away with a lot more knowledge than we have and right now at the end of this. So I'd like to I'm going to introduce all three speakers first, and then we'll launch into the first speaker. Our first speaker will be Dr. Liesl Copeland. Dr. Copeland is the Assistant Dean of Admissions and Medical Education at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. Her responsibilities include conducting educational research in all areas of medical education. She earned her BS at Loyola University of Chicago and her PhD at the University of Virginia. She conducted her postdoctoral training at the Cleveland Clinic, and while at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation, she conducted research in the areas of patient education, graduate education, and continuing medical education. Check all the boxes. She and her colleague, Marianne Huson, were honored with having their paper in the Academic Medicine Classics list. Quite an honor. Dr. Copeland spent many years conducting program evaluations focused on science education, as well as training programs for interdisciplinary research. She has numerous research interests, including defining and promoting interdisciplinary approaches, health literacy, and evaluation use. Her most recent work has looked at the role of professional identity in success as a graduate student and assessed the validity of admissions methods. So welcome to Dr. Copeland. Our second speaker will be Dr. Kadian McIntosh. Dr. McIntosh is the current Dean of Assessment, Evaluation, and Analytics for the College of Veterinary Medicine and Assistant Research Professor in the Educational Policy Studies and Practice Department at the University of Arizona. Dr. McIntosh has a PhD in higher education and graduate certificate in institutional research from Penn State University. She received her master's degree in educational leadership as well as her bachelor's degree in psychology with honors through the Honors College from Florida International University. She works to improve organizations and STEM education by working with executive teams, admissions, diversity and inclusion, as well as curricular, faculty, and student affairs to create better environments and developmental experiences for students, faculty, and staff. Dr. McIntosh's strategic planning and evaluation expertise come from his medical education research, external evaluation roles on nationally competitive grants, executive consulting, project management, research insight roles such as media and learning design evaluation, program assessment coordinator, and data analyst. Check all those boxes. She's been a very busy person. She has a strong focus on learning, development, and mentoring from her research agenda, and work as a team development facilitator, senior diversity educator, instructor, and roles within residence life. Welcome, Dr. McIntosh. Our last speaker this afternoon will be Dr. Ariane Tehrani. Dr. Tehrani is a professor of medicine and education scientist at the Center for Faculty Educators at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine. Dr. Tehrani is the founding co-director of the University of California Center for Climate Health, obviously an important topic, and equity. She is also the director for program evaluation and education continuous quality improvement for the School of Medicine. Her research has informed conversations, research agendas, and policies, and it focuses on advancing knowledge and equity and social justice, professionalism, and education for climate change and health. Her research identifies and addresses the role of accepted assessment and learning environment practices in perpetuating educational disparities, and she studies interventions aimed at creating equity during health professions education. Her research underscores the important role of solutions built on exemplars of success in contributing to equity. She has led studies aimed at identification and remediation of unprofessional behaviors and the role of clinical education and educational continuity in shaping the professional identity of learners and teachers. Dr. Tehrani co-leads the Equity and Justice in Education Initiative. She mentors many students and residents. So welcome, Dr. Tehrani. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Copeland for our first presentation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today and talk a little bit about program evaluation and learn from everybody else on the panel as well. I wanted to focus my introduction on logic models because I really do believe that having a logic model is a strong foundation for making sure that you can set up the different components of your program and of your evaluation. So I wanted to back way up and start with the definition of program evaluation. And really what I want to focus on are two of the biggest differences between program evaluation and educational research. So you'll realize in evaluation that you're using the social science research methods that everybody uses. And so all your methods are the same. Often even your outcomes are the same of an educational research study. So the two differences that I often stress for program evaluation and research, one is that you're focused on a program within its context and with the population it's serving, right? So you're not looking for a generalization. You want to know for my particular program in the particular setting it's in, how well is it working? And then the second is about judgment. Right. So evaluation means you're making a decision, is this working or not? So you're not randomly sampling and saying, is there something I can learn to apply universally? More, it's for my particular program, is it working or not? And then you're going to share enough information about the context, about your population, that others can do the same. They can try to replicate your program in their setting, but they'll know that's within the constraints of your logic model, of your assumptions, of what you're doing within your program. So a logic model, as it implies, it's just a model, right? It's showing what are you putting into, what are your resources of your program to get to the outcomes that you are hoping to get to, right? So you need to know the conditions in which your program exists. And you need to think about those inputs, those resources and assumptions as you're developing that model, showing the model. And you also need to know what you're trying to solve. What is the problem? What is the goal of this program? And what are the questions that you're trying to ask within it? So some of the things you're thinking about as you're creating your logic model are, what are the assumptions I'm making? So what is the literature or even my real world experiences saying about this program? So that helps me to understand, why am I putting in the components to the program that I'm putting? How is this program supposed to work? How am I supposed to use those inputs, those resources, and the program structure itself to get to the outcomes it has? Go ahead. So inputs, when I use that word, we're talking about a lot of things, right? We're talking about the context, both the theory you have, the environment in which you are in, the assumptions you're making, but also the influences outside of your program, the partners you're working with, what you're bringing to this program. And so thinking both about the context, but also resources. And then I have a simple model of a program. And this I pulled from the CDC, but it just helps you that it's really just a flow of, this is what I'm putting into it. These is what I'm doing. This is the activities, the program itself, and these are the outputs. These three things combined should lead towards my outcomes. But at all times, I have to think about the contextual factors that are influencing the activities that are allowing me to understand what the inputs are. And even interpreting the outcomes will be within those contextual factors. So I know part of what I talked about was the literature and the theory and background, and we're all really familiar with the literature about the underrepresentation of a diverse workforce in the physician body. And so we know the literature that says healthcare access, provision of culturally appropriate care increases with a diverse workforce. And so we have a good rationale for the goals that we have. There's even literature on some of the potential barriers. Maybe it's the K through 12 education, the community influences towards certain careers, the cost of tuition for medical school or even applications, the limited knowledge of that pathway of how do you get into medical school, and the biases and stereotypes that many of this population are dealing with. So I wanted to talk about narrowing that down a little bit for our program, right? And so looking at the environment resources in one of the programs that I have. So at my medical school, we have a number of pathway programs that I believe most medical schools do. Some of our programs are housed within the student affairs and special academic programs unit, and a couple of programs are housed within admissions unit, but we're very collaborative across these different pathway programs. So the one I'm focused on is working with high achieving, they're working with undergraduate students that were high achieving high school students, and they had been accepted to a top tier university, actually two that we're working with. Those undergraduate universities are giving these students 100% tuition, as well as covering all their room and board. They're providing them academic support. They're giving them the first in college mentoring support structures. I also know some of my resources and environment is that we have met amazing faculty, and some of my faculty have lived through similar experiences. Maybe they were also financially disadvantaged. Maybe they also were the first in their family to attend and graduate from college. We have amazing medical students and can serve as near peer mentors. And I know my faculty that teach that clerkship, sort of your first courses in medical school, also are really engaging or do a great job with that. And the next slide's good. So when I'm looking at my target audience, I can say, you know, the population this particular program is serving is getting sufficient academic and financial support. And that's an assumption I'm making because of how I've selected them and where they are and what they're getting from their undergraduate university. We did a bit of a needs assessment, and I could say they lack the medical profession mentors. We're not seeing the connection between the science courses that they're taking in undergrad and what they'll be doing as a professional. And that can cause some discouragement about, well, what if I'm not in love with all the science courses I'm doing? What does that mean for me? They're unsure of the steps and the path they're taking. We think that their undergraduate science coursework is excellent and superb, and that's going to cover their needed content. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. We also believe that if we're able to give them an early conditional acceptance, that shows good faith, that gives them that support to continue on the path. This early conditional acceptance is something that we are currently working with on what that will look like in the future as we work with our lawyers to understand what is allowed and not allowed. But 100% this pathway program will continue because we will continue to have our goal of increasing the diversity of the workforce. So I know for resources, right? I know the undergraduate environment is good. It's giving them academic and financial support. I know our partner is really supportive in this. We work closely with the health profession advisor. I know my medical school faculty are really strong, and I know we have funding to provide that summer support as well as give these program participants a stipend. So what are the actual activities? And I'm going to touch back a little bit to the launching model, but what we're including is some lunch lectures to show about the different career paths of physicians. We're giving them one-on-one mentors with a physician. We are giving them exposure to clinical science coursework, and we're also giving them that broader exposure of the practice of medicine. We also give them a medical student TA that can really build that relationship of having recently gone through the acceptance process about their path, why they decided to go to medical school, and work with them on the coursework as well. We were able to give an early conditional acceptance to medical school, and it may be possible that we can continue this for our disadvantaged population, but it's something that we're in the middle of working out right now. And we were able to give them a free MCAS application as well as eliminate the MCAT requirement. So to connect the models, right? So I know I'm working with disadvantaged students and first-gen college students that are underrepresented in medicine. I am able to make the program free. We're able to give them housing. We're able to give them a stipend. And during the application process, we're also able to waive some of that application costs. I am not including any coursework for undergrad, so we don't touch on organic chemistry. We don't touch on biochemistry in our program. And it is because of our assumption that they're getting that they have plenty of that support during the program. Okay. So I had talked about they weren't sure about the path, and so we included pieces of our program that talk about that path to medicine, that make sure they have an option to test for themselves. Is this what they love? We make sure we demonstrate that we do believe in them, that if they're successful in our program, we think they're going to be successful in medical school, and we give that hands-on advice from current students. So output. Output is not your program evaluation outcomes. It's not how well your program is. Output is sort of what you're doing, who you're serving, right? And so we did develop a summer program. It has all the components we need. We have had 35 students, as 5 to 6 students this summer go through that program. And so our output is looking good. And the next is outcomes, right? And so when I think about my short outcomes, our goal for the program is to diversify the workforce, but more specifically, our goal is to have students participate in the summer program, successfully apply and matriculate into medical school, right? And part of my rationale is that they needed to understand the path and they needed to have a strong desire to go to medical school. My program is supposed to help support this path and desire. And so I want to measure that. Does it increase their desire? Does it clarify the path for them? And so I can do a survey. If I'm able to find a survey that others have developed and validated, that's even better, because my stakeholders are going to even trust the survey better because it's been used by others and it seems more valid and reliable then. I want to know how many enter medical school, and this is where I'm working with my partner really closely. So I can certainly pull my own records, but it's really lovely to help the health profession office at that undergraduate university share their records and be able to say, yes, for the students that participate in your program, they are matriculating to this medical school, even if it's not your own. I know AAMC does provide data of who are the matriculants that year. And so you may be able to work with your medical school to see if they have access to that data and can help you do this tracking, because sometimes you do lose track of your own participants. And then we have a further goal because we want them to graduate. And so those that are coming to our program, we're going to use our own records to see their path through it. So here are some of the sort of immediate outcomes of did they like the program. And I don't think this goes far enough, but I highlighted it in blue, a quote that is actually less of an outcome and more going at quality improvement, right? And so my assumption is our faculty are amazing. And I know that my students say our faculty are amazing and I work closely. And so of course I think they're amazing, but it's important that the program participants think that they're amazing, that they actually were really able to develop a relationship and mentoring. And so this type of quote helps get at that. And it's also something else that you may want to be measuring and gathering if that's part of your question. So short-term outcomes, how many matriculated? We've been successful, and most of the students have matriculated to a medical school or are on the path to matriculate into medical school. I wanted to pull out and highlight the three that we have 7 that have not yet applied that should be on the path still. 3 of them we did not invite to apply to our medical school. And so this is where, and Adrian, I think you can jump to the next slide. Thank you. Oh, and then intermediate outcomes. So they are on track, they're into their clerkship phase or they're appropriately in the pre-clerkship phase. And so we're really excited that they're doing it, they're surviving and thriving. But if I go back, and my slides were a little bit out of order, so I will get back to that. No, you can go ahead, Adrian, I'm sorry. So when you're thinking about your program logic model, and I will have a slide to talk about how I go back and think about it. Part of developing that logic model is for planning the program, right? You want to be able to articulate the theory of change for your program. You want to identify some of the assumptions you're making. By planning this program and thinking about all the different pieces, you're going to increase the likelihood of success of your program. You're also going to be able to identify appropriate outcomes measures and really narrow down that it's not just program satisfaction that's really an outcome of this. What is it that would convince everybody that your program's working and convince yourself that your program's working? You can use that program model to narrow down the evaluation focus as well, and to help explain what's working and not. Right, so I had 3 students that didn't meet the conditions to apply to us, which is distressing for our program. So I need to go back to that module and say why. And so I can look at the resources, right? And I can say, you know what, our program relies heavily that they're getting the academic support within the undergraduate university they're at. And so I can look and explore that. Is it true? Was that a false assumption? Or was it something about the particular students that I selected? Or is it the activities weren't right to me for the students we were selected? The other thing is that question about the MCAT, right? And so we have 2 students that are taking a little bit longer to take their step 1. And I am a strong believer in the strength of the MCAT, that it helps you develop new study skills, that it helps you integrate your science knowledge, and that it helps you get a sense that you do have the stamina to go through the licensure exam, right? And so when I did not require the MCAT, did I put these students at a disadvantage? And this is something that we should look at a little bit further and see, is that a problem? Is that a bad assumption with my program? And then there's funding. So the program was very well supported and funded during undergrad, but when they joined medical school, they no longer got a full tuition scholarship. They didn't have the funds to pay for those licensure exams, and they would have to do that out of loans. And so was that concern for these students something that's causing a delay in taking the exam and so forth? So some tips, and I think I'm running out of time. When you develop your model, work collaboratively, your staff, your stakeholders all can help explain why the program, what they want, what they think the program needs, and what the evidence is for that. Really define your problem. It's just like a research question. You need to have it well articulated and thought out. It's not really a linear process. So remember, you are developing these partners. You're remembering the context. You sometimes have to go back and forth and say, were my assumptions right? but don't have the perfect model. It can be a time sink, and you do need to actually implement your program, right? So don't worry about all the details. Reflect on the goals and the outcomes, and sort of what are your outcomes, meaning how do the stakeholders interpret that? Really work with your partners on that program. And just sharing some of the resources I used, but thank you for your time, and I am happy to pass it off to the next speaker. Dr. McIntosh, I believe, is up next.
Thank you so much, Dr. Copeland. I too am a strong believer in logic models. Often we are a little rushed if we're, for example, applying for a grant and when we're going through our logic models, but I believe that they are essential. And so what I will be speaking about is thinking about some other principles, namely from project management, and thinking about how we can utilize those principles as we enact some of the pieces of our logic model. And I'll be primarily focusing on engaging stakeholders and other community members throughout that planning and implementation timeline in order to make your logic model come to life. The first thing that I always say when we're thinking about principles of change is to begin with the end in mind. So I will go over a few tips around this, but I will say, namely, it is remembering the purpose. And if you recall, Dr. Copeland did talk about you need to know what your problem is. And essentially that's what I'm reiterating, where you have to know your concerns. You have to think about what it is that your program is trying to address. At this level, we're often not addressing so much mass retention or graduation issues, but we are thinking about sense of belonging or science knowledge or test taking skills or transition issues. We know that there are certain things that folks are struggling with, and we want to move them to a point where they're thriving. And so we have to think about what are the important things to change in order to reach that goal. If you keep this in mind, it will help you to prioritize what people need to be on board, what practices you need to put in place, the measurements that you will need in order to get through some of those pieces of your logic model, and then of course the actions that you'll take. You'll of course need to identify the things that you do not know as well. Often people skip that, but we should think about what information do you not have already that might help you to think about the pieces of intervention that could really help you, because that's what is going to really aid in addressing concerns. And that is where you highlight what is it that you need to really ask about and to make sure that you're focusing on doing something about those concerns that you ask about. And I will say my tagline here is also, do not ask about concerns you are not willing to do anything about. So you really want to focus. In order to promote change, this is very much like English 101 when you had to write persuasive essays. You really want to think about what evidence you have and how you can leverage that data. So first of all, we want to recruit, we want some buy-in. 2 tips that I have is to create a steering committee and an evaluation team. The steering committee are internal leaders that have different sections of your logic model that might be important to them. And I'll go through the stakeholder piece a little bit further. And then the evaluation team is really because this is a lot of work. And especially if this is not your typical role, you will want to get some assistance in this area. Now, you don't want to have folks that are amongst the people that will be evaluated on the evaluation team, but there are still lots of other ways that you can get help from, for example, maybe not the instructors if you have classes within your pathway programs, but maybe it is another instructor or a related administrator that is within that program that can serve on the evaluation team, or maybe it is external folks or consultants that can help you gather some framework and have a different perspective. I always say it's important to follow those change models. You'll see us really keep talking about theory of change and highlighting backwards design plan, and the next presenter will help you through that. And then think about those show and tell skills that we learned earlier on in our education, where you display what you want as far as numbers or infographics, but then you really tell the background stories. And this is where it's going to be really helpful for you to highlight some cases where you can talk about a typical example of access or success and growth according to those outcomes that you had highlighted in your logic model that you wanted to focus on. And then make sure that you're demonstrating how the connection works from one factor to another, from one area of your logic model to the next. And specifically, I'm thinking of stakeholder communication and engagement. When you are going back to the basics, you will have those areas where you know are focus areas for different stakeholders that you can highlight. When you identify those stakeholders, you'll also be able to think about if they are able or willing to serve on that steering committee or evaluation committee that I mentioned. And yet I find that people have a hard time sometimes identifying those stakeholders. So I have a few examples of how to do that. And one is to think about the CLIP analysis, which says that you should identify who might be collaborators, but also who might be conflicting members of your goal, right? So that you can know upfront who that is. And then also those that have legitimacy, influence, or power, so that you can plan your engagement accordingly. Now, that might look like doing a little spreadsheet where you can understand the impact that someone has, the influence that they might have over your project, but then you want to really think about what's important to them. How would they contribute, or how might they even block the project, and then really go through that engagement strategy for each person. If you're not a table or spreadsheet person, another way to think about this is Venn diagrams and really mapping on people to those areas. And you can even change out those circles of legitimacy, urgency, and power with something else so that it matters more to you. For me, one of the things that I have found really useful is to do stakeholder and leadership interviews. So whenever I'm doing a project, especially that is long-term or has to do with a big change or development, such as a pathway program, I interview folks and I talk to them and ask questions about the context and the history. What was the last program like this? Why did it not continue, or how did it evolve? I asked them to identify goals and track alignment in visions, in the vision of what they would like to see. And I use this as a way to get information about what they might be interested in as far as buying and what they might want as far as communication. And I also usually step back from the quieter role of an interview and then ask more questions or create more of a discussion around potential concerns, limitations, and obstacles. Talk to them about how they might see our program being unique, because some of them might be wondering, well, why would someone come here versus somewhere else? Are there enough pathway programs at this point where it wouldn't be an advantage to have one? And so you can have those discussion pieces. You can talk about what might be metrics that they would feel are helpful. It's also where I do some expectation control, and I talk about what might be realistic and help them understand that educational outcomes are often incremental and that we need to think about long-term as well as short-term goals. And then we walk through process and workflow as well as the engagement piece. It's also important for me to report back out. So I then will gather all the information that I've learned, and I'll share the vision of what folks think a pathway program would best look like as far as serving our particular community and program at this point in time. I have the shared understanding of what some features might be as well. And so we go through that. And then the other pieces I want to highlight is just that, you know, we want to measure a model, measure your logic model, measure your change model. And I always say measure twice too. So think about the different ways to gather information, think longitudinally. And I have some examples for you to look up later as far as making sure that you're following the money and resources. That is a key thing to think about. And so there are different ways to ensure that the areas of intervention that cost the most, that you're really showing how they are worth spending money on. And you want to think about pieces such as a beneficiary exchange or best evidence, where you're synthesizing information from beneficiaries of the project and from other similar projects, as well as key informant interviews, which I use to really think about outsiders and getting information there as far as modeling information. I always say to think about your context and culture as well. So there's some hints that you can look at later as far as looking at your mission and keeping a focus on that, and then thinking about are you matching expert predictions, or are you developing new practices? So I always use last year's information to create workshops for the new pathway participants so that they know that we're using it and the community knows that we are also paying attention to that as well. I look at comparison data, and I make sure that we have counter narratives if I need to change some perspectives as well. So you'll see some different hints about beginning with the end in mind, keeping things relevant, promoting transparency and sharing. But mainly, I think that it's important to think about where you can innovate, and then the continuous quality improvement piece. So if you're really sharing data and being transparent, people will believe that you're not just saying the good, but also the bad. So when it comes to your continuous improvement piece, you will be able to really highlight some of the things you've done and take action, because that's the whole point, right, of your purpose is to address those pieces. So you want to make sure that all the evidence that you have, that you're maintaining that and showing where you'll change, you're taking action, you're showing that you took action, and then you are making the changes that take time and effort, and incrementally addressing those. So thank you so much for being a part of creating more pathway programs.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me, and I'm excited to be able to contribute to continuing this important conversation on evaluation of pathway programs. What I'm going to cover, which is similar to both what Dr. McIntosh and Dr. Copeland have covered, is really describing the current practices for evaluation of pathway programs. I'm going to focus specifically on pathways to medicine, of course, but there are many other kinds of pathway programs, explaining the outcomes of the pathway programs, at least understanding a little bit about what we know to date, and then speaking with you a bit about summarizing future directions for evaluation of pathway programs. So, you know, we've talked about this a little bit already, but, you know, the overall goal of pathway programs is really to increase diversity, opportunity, and reduce underrepresented in medicine students. And I've typed the kinds of programs that we see for training in medicine into really three groups here. These are very high level groupings that are not, there are many variations to this, but really we see a lot of programs that are focused on sort of the elementary and secondary school intersection. And then we have what we call the pre-medical undergraduate pathways. These are programs that occur when students are actually enrolled in their undergraduate program. It's really when students are still in college, and it in some ways marks a critical junction in the commitment to and preparation for application to medical school. And there really aren't any cohesive or recent documentation of the number of such programs. And the cost is typically built into undergraduate training. And then there, of course, are post-bac programs. Again, this we have a bit more documentation, a bit more research on. There are 200 plus programs nationwide. There are about 10 to 100 plus students enrolled in these programs. The cost is about $10,000 to $50,000 a year, and they are single day to multi-year programs. What we also know about the current state of these programs in general are that overall, while we know that individual programs are successful, we do know that overall are underrepresented in medicine. Representation in medicine has been stable over the course of the past few years. Really, in terms of the kinds of things that evaluation of pathway programs have focused on, studies have explored sort of a range and continuum of the factors that contribute to underrepresentation. I think Dr. Copeland underscored this very nicely in her presentation. In terms of research on the undergraduate pathway programs, what we do know is that the pathway programs description have focused really primarily on description of the programs, focusing on things like cognitive factors such as academic preparation. We also know they focus on foundational science coursework sometimes, supporting learning strategies, preparation for research, exposure to clinical settings, guidance on how to apply to medical school, including preparation for taking the MCAT and financial aid, the use of mentors and advisors, and really opportunities for professional socialization, social activities, and a little bit on identity development, more so in recent programs. And then we also know in terms of outcomes, and again, most of this data comes from post-bac programs because we know so much more, is that there are wide-ranging programs and their outcomes really focus on evaluation, primary anecdotal program satisfaction, when available, whether or not schools are preparing for successful application, admission to medical school, and then some on medical school performance outcomes. There are fewer programs that characterize the undergraduate pathway components and how those cultivate support. And, understanding processes that really contribute to outcomes is particularly important because many of these programs have had greater success with medical school preparation, application outcomes compared to others. So, both Dr. Copeland and Dr. McIntosh have spoken really about the definitions of evaluation, so I'm not going to go through that here. What I did want to just put up here is really thinking about all the various ways in which we define evaluation, how the definition that we choose will tend to frame the way in which we choose to evaluate our programs. And so the bottom line is that the evaluation's ultimate goal is really to provide credible evidence that fosters a greater understanding and improves decision-making that's aimed at improving the social conditions, promoting healthy and just and equitable communities, and education is important to that. And so with that framing in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about the next slide, please. The future pathways for the future directions for really what evaluation of pathway programs should look like, building on what I summarized in terms of the research to date and what we know about it. And I will provide a case example of a program that we have at the University of California, San Francisco throughout. And then there are some areas which we actually don't have ample evidence on. And so the three areas I'm going to talk about are aims and processes by which programs cultivate support, how we think about selecting theories, evaluation models, or approaches, and how we make sure that we employ evaluative thinking that's grounded in justice and equity in the design, from start to finish of the evaluation planning and process. and then determining evolving evaluation of outcomes. And I'll talk about sort of the directionality of those next. So we know that social factors beyond academic achievement impact, for example, our underrepresented learners' choices to select a career in medicine. And this includes identity, awareness of skill by which to confront sociocultural barriers, for example, experiences with educational inequities and bias, and really preparation to address societal health concerns and healthcare disparities. And really echoing, I think Dr. McIntosh said it perfectly, with keeping the end in mind. We do need to keep examining enrollment, success, and application to medical school. We should be exploring how individual program components and processes contribute to those aims. And a limited number of pathway programs describe these sorts of outcomes and how the processes and components are really aiming to cultivate support. And this is where, similar to the logic model, program theory, which is the theory that describes how and why a program is intended to work, or how the processes and outcomes of that program are achieving the outcomes, or what we call a theory of change, which describes the process of change by outlining the causal linkages. Actually, if we could go back, that'd be really good. Thank you, Adrian. Sorry for that. Really how sort of how the causal linkages lead to sort of those outcomes, and then the shorter, intermediate, and longer term outcomes. So a lot of alignment here between the concepts of a logic model. But I just want to make sure that we really saw that the linkage between the 3 bullet points that I have here, which is that we are, of course, focused on the end. We're still examining program components, and we're continuing to build a program theory of change of how it works, because this is actually very minimal in the literature. And now the next slide. Thank you, Adrian. And so with that in mind, I wish I had an example of a theory of change in a pathway program that I could provide for you. But this is one of the most wonderful theories of change that I've seen about a program. This is focused on a children's foundation in New York City, which is an organization that makes sort of a 10-year commitment to support children from underserved communities through a summer program that really focuses or helps children make ethical and healthy decisions to become engaged citizens and succeed in school. And this particular theory of change shows how each component of the program leads to the ultimate outcomes, the fulfillment, the positive contributions to society, which is what they see as the end product. And as we think about pathway programs, are we also thinking about those individual components and how they really build on each other? So for example, when we're providing MCAT preparation and advising, how are those two interacting with each other to lead to that ultimate outcome? And ultimately, the choice to apply to medical school and sustaining a passion to serve the health of society. Next slide, please. So the second sort of area or direction that we have to think about with evaluation planning for pathway programs is really selection of theories, evaluation approaches, and evaluative thinking. In the health sciences, in medicine, and other health professions, we do tend to be very positivist, and we believe that there's one end product or one end game that we are trying to get at. And we do tend to study and focus directly on meeting those outcomes, and that is very legitimate and very needed. And we do tend to focus on enrollment in medicine as a core part of that outcome. But we often do not tend to connect our work to the larger educational theories that underscore the choices and the decisions for why we even set up the pathway program the way that we do. Why do we even provide mentoring? And so the model we tend to ascribe to is one that focuses on outcomes, but really does so at the cost of thinking about a lot of the other things. And this relates to the slides that I spoke about earlier with program theory, program change. But also we often don't think about the evaluation investigator team and whether or not that team is applying evaluative thinking in this context. And I want to talk about each of these 3 areas next. So, as we think about the education theories that govern our work and why we choose to even develop the programs we do, we usually will frame our evaluation findings based on some sort of education theory. And here's an example of a theory that we believed explained our pathway program at the University of California, San Francisco, and how it really structured the way in which we designed our program and our structure. This is a Swales model for persistence and achievement, which asserts that student persistence and achievement are the results of the intersections of these three areas that you see here: cognitive, so how students are academically prepared and supported; social, whether there is peer and familiar encouragement and sociocultural barriers; and then institutional, really how is the institution supporting the learner, the academic, the social support, and the curriculum. And what we learned through our evaluation was that our program was really that institutional support, but how it was intersecting with the social and cognitive really pushed us to think in a different direction about how the institution support cannot live in absence of the cognitive and the social. And so in our paper, we've proposed a modification to this particular model to help accommodate that. Next slide, please. I also want to underscore that we do tend to use program evaluation approaches that are very prescriptive and very positive. As like I said, that's a very health science way of focusing on things, but there are many other evaluation approaches that can help us decide how we think about that evaluation design. So for example, the constructivist design is one that really focuses on going beyond objectives and saying, is the program service or social oriented? Is our evaluation focused on that? And are we employing methodologies that help us get at that description and that judgment that goes into what makes a program successful? The democratic deliberative, one of the programs that we are currently evaluating, really focuses on whether or not we have included the voices of those. So through democratic deliberation and participation, providing authentic stakeholder input. And I think Dr. McIntosh spoke to this beautifully. And then really looking at arriving at a defensible assessment of a program's merit and growth. There are many other models here. I am not going to go through all of them: the transformative, the equity focused, the feminist. All other participatory approaches in general do fit this bill, but I wanted to leave you with some ways of thinking about the ways in which you design your evaluation plan can draw on multiple approaches beyond the objectives or goal-focused ones, which should always still be there, but there are other ways of looking at the data. I'm not going to go into evaluative thinking in depth because I do think we are running out of time and we want to make sure we allow time for dialogue. But evaluative thinking is a key component of evaluation capacity and practice. It's particularly important. It's important for all evaluation planning, but really important as we think about programs that focus on equity and justice. And really, are we employing an attitude of inquisitiveness as an evaluation team? Are we bringing a belief in value of evidence? Are we identifying our assumptions as evaluators? And are we bringing to bear deeper understandings of reflection and perspective taking through our evaluation plan? And then finally, I really want, the next slide, please, is to push us to think about where does research or where does evaluation in this area need to go? And the four areas that I do think we do need to spend some time with determining with pathway programs is, are we looking at how well these programs are preparing our learners to address societal health concerns, health disparities? Are we preparing our learners to really be able to address sociocultural barriers post-participation? So really what happens in that transition when they do start medical school and are faced with the inequities of medical training and healthcare, and cultivating a strengths and assets-based framework and approach, making sure that we have a growth mindset in how we are designing our evaluation plan. Like, what are the outcomes that we're looking at? Are we looking at access and success? And then promoting and celebrating identity as a part of our evaluation planning and what we're looking at in terms of outcomes, because so much of that individual identity that comes into patient care creates a stronger physician force and therefore more support for patients and healthcare problems. And we do need to underscore that in our evaluation planning. I'm going to quickly just focus on two of these. One of them is the assets or the strengths-based framing. I really want to make sure that as we, the next slide, please. As we think about our focus on the outcomes that we want to look at, that we're focusing on assets, and the anti-deficit model is a wonderful example of that. It's a framing that really makes sure that we ask our questions, our evaluation questions, from the perspective of assets and strengths, and doesn't focus on deficits. And really, this particular model, which has been used in the National Black Male College Achievement Study and other studies in higher education, and draws on theories from sociology, psychology, gender studies, and education, has really been a very strong way in which to look at outcomes in other areas of medicine and medical training, and really would have a nice place in evaluation of pathway programs. And then the next slide, and the final slide, really is identity plays an important role in the choice to pursue medical school, and the role that learners assume and the challenges they face in training, and ultimately the strengths and the capacities that they bring to the workplace all really need to be a part of that training and a part of the ways in which we examine the outcomes that we look at. And so I want to make sure that we underscored that. And so in closing and in summary, my final slide is I was hoping to leave you with the current state of pathway programs evaluations and where to go next, which are the 3 areas that I've outlined here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the subsequent dialogue.
Well, thank you all very much. That's such a wealth of information that there were some questions about, will the slides be available after the session? And I'll leave that up to, excuse me, the AAMC staff to take care of that. So if I could have all of the presenters. So thank you all. I mean, I don't, it's it's like, where do we really start? I am going to start with the question about something I think about in doing this work, and that is, and I think you just might be calling it something different than I do. So when I think about evaluations, I think a lot of people think you evaluate the program. Is the program good? Is everybody happy? Were the mentors okay, et cetera? All the different pieces of it, but impact, to me, is what we really want to know. I think you've built that. I think you're talking about that. I think you're just calling it something else. But I think you are looking at impact, because obviously the goal is to diversify, the workforce. And so that is, are we having that impact? It's very soon to tell. I mean, in our programs, we don't know that yet because they're not anywhere near in the workforce. But, and those intermediate markers, Dr. Copeland, that you were talking about. You could address that, each of you, and how you think about impact in your programs. I'll start with Dr. Copeland.
Sure. So I agree, it's hard because there's a reach from your immediate program to that long-term goal. And so I think one of the things I always keep in mind is that our goal is not for our own medical school. And so it's making sure you can measure that impact a little broadly and say, how can I look across multiple programs and see what's happening? And how can I see, just keep in touch with my participants as they go out, so we can see, are they actually joining the workforce, and in what way are they doing that? I also think there's a way to take a step back and say, maybe it's not about my program, maybe it's about those connections. And so thinking a little bit broadly and saying, is there something about doing this work which builds those opportunities for connections to be made, and so that other people can build on this work and continue, right? And so looking at your undergraduate partners, looking at other places to see, can we be looking at impact because we're thinking more broadly and we're going outside of our own individual program.
Dr. McIntosh, anything to add to that, and how you think about that in your programs?
Sure, I would say that in evaluation work in general, I think language is an issue, right? So I think of, process evaluation more of is, how well is the program working? Whereas outcome evaluation is still about the program, but it's the degree to which the program is having an effect on, let's say, the participants' behaviors or affect. And then for me, what people normally don't get to is the impact evaluation,
Mhm.
which is thinking out still within the program, but how does the program meet its ultimate goal? And if that ultimate goal is, for example, diversifying the workforce, right? It's not necessarily about the program, but you have to follow the program evaluation steps in order to get there. So I think it's really important to think about what those bigger picture reasons are that you wanted to address, whether they are institutional goals or regional or state goals about impact as far as really making a big difference. And it's impact evaluation that's going to really get at providing evidence for using for policy and for funding decisions as well. So it is really important to think about things from the impact point of view.
Thank you. Dr. Tehrani.
Actually, I don't have much that's different to add. I agree with everything that both other speakers have said. I also do think about impact is that, I do think ultimately it is also about that transition into, for example, medicine itself. So, once our learners are there, so if the program has met its impact of increasing and diversifying the workforce, once learners are in medical training, what is that experience? Is that experience continuing to be inequitable? Because it doesn't end there. And so I do think about impact as beyond just whether we're making the numbers, but are we making medicine a successful and happy place for everyone to exist in?
Thank you. So another question, I heard you all refer to partners. So we have a number of pathway programs at MD Anderson. The one I run is a little different because we have partners that we work with. I'd like to hear a little more about your thought about partners, and if you use partners, how do you bring them in? Who are they, et cetera? How do they fit into your program? Dr. McIntosh, start with you.
Sure. I've used partners in different ways, and I've been a partner in different ways. And I'll say one of the first ways that I was involved in different types of pathway programs, some with the leadership lens, some with science, and some with mentoring, is because my background is education, and people would reach out to me as an education person. And so that might be a way that you want to partner with folks at your institution, is to reach out to professors in the College of Education. And many of us have evaluation as part of our expertise. And so you can build your evaluation team that way or get some consultation that way. The other piece I would say as far as partnership is to think about the larger impact pieces, right? So if you want to have a pulse on what is happening, for example, with your alumni when they're in the field, do you have anyone in the field where your alumni typically go to, such as residency programs, where you might be able to partner with them in order to see what some later transitions might look like for them? Because it gets to maybe some of those number outcomes, but also that affect and the climate issues, for example, that Dr. Tehrani was speaking of. There are also, larger health organizations to partner with, community resources. And I think sometimes we typically don't even look enough in our own institutions. So just as I was saying, the College of Education, there's also other health education programs that I think would welcome partnership. So, I've recently moved from medical education to veterinary medical education, but I'm still partnering a lot with many folks in different types of areas. And so I think to realize that all knowledge is not necessarily in one place is very important.
There was a paper a few years ago in academic medicine called NIEHS, not invented here syndrome. Those of us in academic medicine and science tend to think that everything has to emanate from that academic sphere, when in fact there are other places we should be looking as well. Dr. Copeland, you did mention partners as well.
We do, and I think I would agree with everything that has been said. I think sometimes when you have to brainstorm about partners, you really need to be honest about what you have and about what your question is, and then look broadly to say, is there someone that could work with me and collaborate so that there's a win-win, and so that you're able to better serve the problem that you're trying to address. So we use partners when we're looking at recruitment and identifying our population. We use partners when we're thinking about what outcome measures would be useful for our program. And I think it is really valid to sometimes think about, oh, I'm in a health system it's not just the MDs. And so what might I be doing, and how might we be serving the undergrads better if we did work a little bit more collaboratively?
Dr. Tehrani, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think those are all very well said. My partnerships are key from start to finish, right? It's the input of everybody at the table all along. And I mean, one nice partnership example is we're working on a secondary study of our program to understand why some of our participants chose to delay the application to the medical school process. And my partners in that work are two of the prior participants of the program who are now in their third year of medical school, and have a lot of incredible input to offer on what might be happening and what this evaluation design should look like.
Thank you. So there's a question in the chat. So pathway programs have a long-term impact on learners' career trajectories. What strategies can be employed, or have you seen, to measure their success beyond the programs, or not, when they leave us, when they leave our program? How do we measure? How are you measuring that success? Dr. Tehrani, start with you this time.
Yeah, that actually is that is the next phase of work that we are doing. We are looking at it, like I said, two ways. We're looking at it for those who chose not to, or not to apply, but to extend their application time, and why they felt that way. And then also looking at the learners who are now in medical school and really understanding the continuum from start to finish, and how the application process went, what were their lessons learned, and in retrospect, how they could have been better prepared. We're looking at it we're looking at students who've been admitted to multiple places. So we do have some data to help shed light eventually on really whether it's space and location, type of school, all those things that will make a difference. I don't have results from that yet, but I will look forward to sharing that when we do have that.
We'd look forward to that. Anybody else like to comment on that? Dr. Copeland, I'm going to go clockwise here.
I don't think I have anything to add. I do think we definitely do it within our own institution. You'd have to go back to the partners to think about collecting that across institutions, and it's definitely worthwhile goal, and something I think a lot more people are trying to do now, is follow them longer term, seeing how that relates back to their own programs.
Dr. McIntosh.
Here, I typically think about those impact goals, and for many of the programs, especially within my current university's context, in Arizona, where I am, there has been a lot of initiative around keeping folks in the state, for example, right? So we track whether or not they stay in the state, but also what type of work they're doing. So it might be, are they in a rural area, urban area, on a native lands? And so we really want to have that idea of the type of work they're doing, where they're doing it, private practice, public, the type of community organizations that they're involved in is another piece that I use for other programs. Looking at also career progression can be something that folks track over time. And even, the same things that we do for example, faculty productivity. If, for some folks, it might be that your impact is that you want to create more faculty members, right? Academic physicians. So you might want to track if they go that route and what type of institutions they choose to participate in. And then, from there, typical faculty productivity metrics can be involved as well. But I think it's also important to think about what goals your participants said that they wanted to have when they started the program, and to follow through and see if those goals were met later on as alumni or within their career outcomes. So the goals that you want as far as the impact of your program, but also the goals that the participants want are good ones to start with.
Okay, so I think we have a question here that is, and I like this question because it's kind of a takeaway. Are there any tips or best practices that you would tell people in developing formalized mentoring opportunities within a program, and one that extends past the pathway they're in? And then how do you use partners? Do you utilize your partners for this? So the first part is, are there any tips or best practices for this? And then how do you utilize partners in the mentoring part of the pathway programs? Anybody want to put their hand in the air and take a stab at this? Okay, Dr. Tehrani.
Sure, yeah. That's the one aspect of pathway programs I think we know a lot about, that consistent mentors that relate to learners, mentors that are present and make time, are a huge force in making for a successful program. I think there's actually a review. I'll have to go back and dig it up, and I'm happy to share it with the group after, that really talks about the needed facets, or the best, I wouldn't say it's best practices, more a summary of the literature on mentoring and what works and what doesn't in pathway programs and other similar programs. So I'm happy to share that. There was a second part to the question, which was,
how do you utilize partners in the mentoring piece of your pathway program, or do you?
In the program that I help run the evaluation for, and the other programs at our institution, yes, partners are they are intermingled throughout everything that's done. So in terms of partners, for example, there are many healthcare providers out there who work with mentors to join forces to help provide guidance to learners about career opportunities, post-medicine, sort of opening up like this idea of, if you do go to medical school, there's so many other things that you can do and will be able to do once you finish, which many of our learners don't know about. So a lot of healthcare providers, policymakers, we have partners across our undergraduate institutions. I am at an institution that does not have undergraduate programs, and we are only a healthcare institution. So I do feel very jealous of the setup that Dr. McIntosh has, but we do tend to focus and work with other partners in the University of California and the California State University system that helps bring in not just mentors, but also learners and other experts at the table to contribute to the program and help mentor learners.
Thank you. So just very quickly, Dr. Copeland, do you have, Dr. McIntosh, you just put your hand in the air. Would you like to give us one tip? Like to give the audience one tip, and then Dr. Copeland?
I would say similarly, there are lots of mentoring literature out there that is STEM broadly. So even if it's not medicine, please look into it. There's lots of great tips. Specifically, I would say that you want to address many levels of mentoring, and that is what is, it's important for your students to learn that they should have many mentors, not just one, and many different types of mentors and stakeholders as far as people who will help them on their journey. So peer mentors are helpful, and that has been used a lot in pathway programs, and helpful on both ends for both peer parties. And think about the healthcare professionals. Also utilize national institutions who might be looking for mentees. So, or your local, so the Women in Science or medicine, the BINGAP, building the next generation of academic physicians. Make connections with different folks in those organizations who might be willing to serve as mentees, and look across your campus and your community as well, because people do want to be connected sometimes to programs like these.
So I'm sorry, Dr. Copeland, I have to wind this down. Our learners are going to be leaving us here, but I'm looking at the numbers and not very many have left. So obviously, this has been such a rich discussion. It really has. It's been a wonderful discussion. I want to thank, first of all, I want to thank all of our participants, and I can't see any of you. Thank you for being here. It's really, it's a testament to you and how important this is to you in what you're doing, that you're participating, taking the time here to think about this and then take these lessons learned. I also want to thank our speakers. It's a very, very rich conversation that we could go on and on here for a long time. So thank you all very much. It was a very, very rich conversation. And I want to also hope that all of you out there who are part of this community will continue to share your best practices with each other, and also help each other in addressing any challenges that we all meet when we're doing this kind of work these days. So again, thank you all very much. It's really been a very rich and wonderful session. So thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Travis. And participants, please give us your feedback on today's presentation by filling out the webinar evaluation that will pop up on your screen as soon as we end. We recorded this session and we will email you when it's ready. On behalf of the Association of American Medical Colleges, thank you to our speakers and, of course, all of today's participants. Have a wonderful day.
Bye, everyone.